So I'm just going to grab my phone to make sure I have the right time. So it's 12:29, Don. So I'll start my introduction just after 12:30.
Very good.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the University of Missouri St. Louis. My name is Eamon Wall. I'm the Smurfit Stone Chair of Irish Studies at the University at UMSL Global, and everybody is most welcome to this event today. It is our final event of the semester, and we will be resuming again in the spring. And so in addition to welcoming you today, I just want to wish everybody a happy and Thanksgiving and happy Christmas time and holiday season. A special thanks to Leanne Constantine, the Executive Director of UMSL Global, and to Bob L., our events coordinator, for making today's event possible. Before introducing our speaker, I'll just outline a few of the forthcoming events for the spring semester of 2022. We begin our programming on February 8th with a visit from two Irish writers, Patrick Keogh and Susan Lindsay. On March 8th, we will have a concert with Pat Broaders and Andrew O'Brien. It's possible that this will be a live concert on the campus, although we're not certain at the moment. If not, it will be on Zoom. On April 12th, we will have a program on Eamon de Valera's visits to America. And on April 16th, then we will have our gala concert in the Toohill, and this will feature the great performer Martin Hayes. So the tickets are on sale for the Martin Hayes concerts through the Toohill. And also next summer, our summer program in Galway will resume. It runs from June 20th to July 19th. And it's open to UMSL students, students from other universities, and to lifelong learners. If you have any questions about any of these events, and you can just get in touch with me by email at walle@umsl.edu. And I will put this in the chat so you will have it there. Today's presentation will run for 45 minutes, and then it will be followed by a question and answer. If you have any questions, please write your questions in the Q&A space at the bottom of the page, and I will read them out to our speaker. In a couple of days, this presentation will be available on the YouTube channel at UMSL Global. So if you want to watch it again, or if you want to get other people to watch it, it will be available then. So our guest today is Don Carrigan, and Don is an award-winning and highly respected journalist and writer. He has two books forthcoming: American Roadkill from McFarland and Amazing Webster Groves. Both books either on their way or almost there. For many years, he edited the Webster Kirkwood Times while also serving as a professor at Webster University, where he continues to teach. Don has always been engaged with his Irish heritage, and he was awarded prestigious fellowships to visit and study the north of Ireland to better understand the Troubles from 1968 to 1998. Today, Don joins us to report on his experiences in the north and to provide us with insights and analysis garnered on these visits. It is a timely lecture, I think, because we are approaching the centenary of the setting up of the Free State and the partitioning of Ireland, 1921, 1922. So please join me with a warm welcome for Don Carrigan.
Thank you, Professor Wall. I appreciate being able to talk about this. It's been a passion of mine. I see that the entry slide says the Troubles, and you sort of referred to 1998 to 2008 as kind of the, parameter for when those happened. I think you can almost say they've been going on for 500 years, and given the Irish, they could go on in some fashion for another 500 years. I took a little piece and studied them and did some journalism. One of the things I was fortunate to get is a fellowship to do a seminar on peace at the threshold at the University of Coleraine, Ulster. And I want to start by just talking about this book, because when I was in high school, senior year, I picked up Bernadette Devlin's Price of My Soul, and she was kind of a rock star at the time. She did a tour of the United States. She was on Johnny Carson, 60 Minutes, Buckley's Firing Line. She was quite controversial on her visits, but I just got a kick out of her, and I got a kick out of her book because, having grown up in a parochial school with the nuns, I kind of appreciated what she talked about with the old rap on the wrist and some of her run-ins with the nuns. But very serious person, but still a person who was clever and witty and above all defiant. So she does a really good job in her book talking about the beginning of the Troubles, and of course she was in the middle of the action for decades. I want to talk a little bit to the international students who might be majoring in international affairs or global media that are watching this. My own orientation was to get into journalism at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, and they had a global emphasis. So I studied global journalism, and my ideal was to be a foreign correspondent. That term is being retired these days. And actually, when I got out of school in the late 1970s, there was a recession, deep recession, and a lot of news outlets, newspapers and TV were closing down their foreign bureaus, as they were called at the time. So I'd gone on the London reporting program, and that was actually my first experience doing stories from Ireland. But my chances of being a foreign correspondent were curtailed by the recession, and then the beginning of the mass cut down of foreign bureaus and foreign reporting. So you got to make your own breaks, and that's a message I have for students that are interested in this area. Make your own breaks, find your own ways to travel and to get funded on travel. There's plenty of fellowships and grants available for that, so you just got to do some research. In my case, I was very lucky to be at the right place at the right time. I started a newspaper group in St. Louis with a couple of young people from Webster University who were interested in doing that. And once the paper got off the ground, I decided I'd be the foreign correspondent for the paper. So although the newspaper didn't fund me, I found ways to get to Ireland and Russia and Bosnia and Vietnam, and with study groups and with journalists, and that enabled my ambition to be sort of a foreign correspondent. Now, obviously, I couldn't do hard news, so most of the writing I did was freelance feature writing, and also op-eds, opinion pieces for editorial pages. Interestingly enough, American newspapers don't cover Ireland as much as I think they should, especially when you consider that we have 35 million descendants of the Irish here in the United States. And there's a lot of interest, I think, in Irish affairs, and coverage shouldn't be confined to what I would call the St. Patrick's Day ghetto, when newspapers and the media focus on Ireland around the time of St. Patrick's Day. Although as a media person, I know I'm going to get a lot more bites for my freelance work during that period, because newspapers and magazines are looking for articles during that time. So in reading a little bit of my bio up there, you'll see that I was able to go to Belfast and Derry and Culleran at the time of the Easter Agreement. And so I'll talk a little bit about the study trip of scholars and journalists and how we learned about what was happening with the peace process. And the seminar that I went on to gather this information was called On the Threshold of Peace. Interestingly enough, when I go through my slides, the first slide is after the Easter Agreement, because there were a lot of, shouldn't say a lot, but there were forces in Ireland, Northern Ireland, that did not want this agreement, and they were looking for ways to trip it up and to stop it. And so I start with the first slide, and this is coverage of the Omagh Mall bombing, in which 29 people were killed and more than 220 were injured. The police and intelligence services pinned it on the real IRA, which is a splinter group of the Irish Republican Army. They hoped that with this bombing, they could hurt the peace process. Now, this was about 12 weeks after I had reported on the peace process, but interestingly enough, I was in the UK again when this happened, on a London Studies media tour with students from Webster University. So I actually grabbed this issue of the Sun and a lot of other stories because it was so appalling and so distressing, and raised so many questions about whether the peace process was possible. The slaughter that took place at the mall because of this bombing, in fact, though, just redoubled everybody's efforts. And I think one of the reasons for that was because everybody suffered from this horrible bombing. Mothers, fathers, children, a pregnant mother were all killed in this. And it was Catholics and Protestants and nationalists and loyalists. Everybody suffered. And so that really caused, I think, people to redouble their efforts for peace and to make the Easter Agreement a reality. So here's another British paper talking about, it's Tony Blair talking about what happened in the bombing and how we aren't going to give up. We aren't going to give up because of this terrible event. And of course, that was echoed by a lot of American leaders and religious leaders from around the world. So this gets back to January of 1998, when I arrived. Americans are always, anybody that studies this and talks to people in Northern Ireland, you're surprised by some of the things that are related to this. And of course, the maze is the prisons where the loyalists in the IRA, particularly the paramilitaries, are imprisoned. And for Americans, it's really a quandary. You wonder, well, why do these people have to be consulted? They're prisoners. Why do they have to be stirred into the peace process? Well, peace really depends on the way these people behave. And also, a lot of political parties, whether they like to admit it or not, get their power and are taken seriously because of what the paramilitaries might do. They're kind of behind them. And so that's a reason why they had to be consulted during this peace process. Of course, a lot of people ask the question, what will happen in the peace process if the prisoners are let go, whether their sentences are commuted? Hardliners, particularly conservatives in the British Parliament, of course, Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom, the Parliament questioned, the conservatives in particular questioned whether a peace deal was really possible. And they also very upset about the idea that some of these mass murders, in their view, should be freed to just maybe do it again. But one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And so from the unionist or the nationalist perspective, and of course the unionists are the Northern Irish who want to stay with Britain, and the nationalists are looking more south towards a possible unification of Ireland. So when you see this, is again, it's one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So the foreign secretary for the UK, she was there while we were there, and she was negotiating and actually visiting the prisoners in the maze. And of course, she got a lot of ink for this, but a lot of it was not flattering. Before this edition, there were a lot of editions that said she was crazy, that this wouldn't work. But when she got them to back off the paramilitary prisoners in the maze and to not, to kind of call a ceasefire, she was congratulated. She did it. She was able to begin the Easter peace process to conclusion. While we were there, Ted Kennedy came to Derry, and he gave a speech at the Guildhall there. We were able to sit in on that. For me, it was extremely moving. And one of the things that they did at this event was they brought in parents of children killed in bombings by the IRA or bombings by the UVF on the other side. Of course, both sides would deny or did deny that they were involved in some of these nasty events. But very emotional to see these parents get up on the stage. I'll never forget the Protestant father who said that hanging on a cross is nothing to what I endured when I found out my son was killed. And he said he looked up to the heavens and said, why? And the Catholic mother pretty much said the same thing. This is just insane what we're doing to each other. It has to stop. And I really admired Ted Kennedy for going over there, getting in the middle of this. I know Ted Kennedy had his flaws and he has plenty of critics in the United States, but I will forever be moved by what he said and what he did there. I mean, the other thing that he did, which I thought showed extreme bravery, was he went out into the Protestant areas and talked to people. And, a lot of people, the security people in Northern Ireland were not happy about this because they worried. But I thought, how brave of this man who's lost both of his brothers to assassination in the United States to go out and wade into these crowds that could be hostile. And I think it's a credit to him and to a number of other officials from the United States, and including a fellow named Mitchell, who went over there to get this accomplished. So I turn now to where the University of Ulster at Coleraine is, and this is a view from the back of the university, and it really shows why they call it the Emerald Isle. Beautiful kind of rural setting for the university, but interestingly enough, the Catholics that we talked to were upset because they said the Protestants put this university down there so the Catholic poor in Ulster, in Derry, could not benefit from it. So there was controversy about everything. And this is the university building with classrooms where we met to interview different parties to the conflict. And there were a lot of parties to the conflict. It's not like Democrats and Republicans in America. There are splinter groups from every party. I know a lot of scholars on this tour, Threshold of Peace. Americans were just flabbergasted and they started sort of joking. Well, there's the PUP, there's the DUP, there's the SDLP, there's the IRA, there's this fringe group of the IRA. We can't keep track of it all. I was a serious journalist, so I was sitting there taking notes as each member of these parties came in and talked to us. And after writing about 5 and taking notes on about 5 or 6 different parties, I said, well, this is kind of pointless because no newspaper in America is going to engage in this kind of minutia. So I sat back and talked to these people closer. Sean Farren from the SDLP, the Social Democratic Labor Party, he was the one who sort of led the seminar, and he arranged for all these different people to come and speak with us. But they had to keep them separated because they were at each other's throats. So they were kind of like kept in different rooms, and then they were brought out to talk to us, and then they were kind of released. I remember talking to the extreme nationalists who said, we won't be happy until the Brits are out. The loyalists and the Ulster Volunteers depend on their connections to the UK and to the British, and we want them out. We want unification. We want, this has to be the eventual outcome of the peace process in our view. And then on the other side, you had the loyalists. I actually went for drinks. That's kind of a common Irish tradition with one of the Ulster conservatives. And in the interview, he was fairly moderate, but when I went to have a Guinness with him and his fellows, they asked me a very pointed question. They said, Mr. Carrigan, what do you think of me? What do you think my country is? Who do you? And I said, well, I guess you call yourself Northern Irish. And he said, no. He goes, I am a subject of the United Kingdom. I am sworn to the crown. I come from an area that has given England, the United Kingdom, members of parliament, great military leaders. So he said, I don't want to see the connection end. He said, the nationalists who talk about how the British are going to leave and I'm not going to be a British subject, he said they might as well believe in Santa Claus because that's not going to happen. And it's very sad that people who are adults believe in Santa Claus, which of course was a good quote for me to use in some of my feature stories. And then I turned around and talked to the nationalists, and I pointed that question. I said, you know, these folks think you're believing in Santa Claus. And then they said, no, they're the ones who believe in Santa Claus because they're kidding themselves if they think the British are going to stay here forever and keep providing them protection. And so made for interesting he said, she said kind of journalism, which is what American media often bite on. They like that. But it also saddened me because they were so far apart. So I'll continue with the show. After we met with these folks at the university, we traveled to Belfast, and then after that to Derry. So the next portion of slides is from Belfast. And this is a street in Belfast, which shows what you might say looks pretty peaceful, pretty almost prosperous with the number of cars there. But as you travel out of the main areas of Belfast, you begin to see the graffiti, the murals that pretty much praise one side or the other side in this conflict, the Troubles. So this is the Ulster Volunteer Force, one of their murals in which they, of course, pay homage to their British roots. We'll talk a little bit about that subsequent to looking at these slides. So the UVF, other splinter groups they all have their own murals. And so that was one of the things we did on the tours, is talk to these people and also look at the mural work to talk about what their positions are. This is a pretty well-known area for anybody who covers or studies the Troubles, the Shankill Protestant boys. The Shankill's a neighborhood that predominantly Protestant, although there are Catholic families that live in that area. And then you move to the Catholic or nationalist areas of Northern Ireland, and you see their take on things on their murals. And of course, this is a pretty detailed mural talking about a lot of different history. It's not only a war of occasionally bullets and a war of words, it's also a war of murals. This is a pretty interesting mural, and it's pretty much aimed at British colonialism, or what they feel is British colonialism. And it goes back hundreds of years. And of course, the genocide of which the Irish nationalists feel is perpetrated on them, and that they were behind the farming and cultivation methods that led to the potato famine. Of course, this is one of the reasons why we have so many Irish over in the United States. It's not just Catholic Irish, it's the Protestant Irish, approximately 50-50 in the United States of these 32 to 35 million Irish that moved over here. This is one of the things I found when I was there, is a lot of the murals for the nationalists were really pushing for the Brits to leave. Not so much taking aim at the Unionists, but more taking aim at the British, that it's time for peace. It's time for you to go, and we'll get this thing settled once you leave. So this is a sort of an expansive view of Belfast, kind of a drab industrial city. I hope some of you go see the movie Belfast, which was just released. It does a number of these kind of overview pictures of Belfast, and I sat and wondered, well, why is this movie doing this? And I think part of it is just to show what an industrial city is, and how the Brits, when they really came and took over all the way back to 1500. But as far as Northern Ireland goes, one of the things that they cultivated the city for was to make ships and for World War I and World War II tanks. It was a prime area for the Nazis to bomb in World War II. Interestingly enough, the casualties were much higher on the Catholic side, and that's because the shanties and poor housing that Catholics lived in tended to be around these industrial sites that were, again, prime targets for the Germans. That picture that I took of sort of an overview of Belfast was up from the Catholic cemetery, where a lot of what they look at as martyrs to the cause, martyrs to the conflict. And again, I mentioned that the Mays prisoners, the IRA and the Unionists that are in prison, they're heroes on both sides. Of course, this prison has, this cemetery has special meaning for the Catholics because it's where a number of the hunger strikers were buried. Of course, the hunger strikers in the early 1980s, They protested prison conditions, how long they were there, will they ever get out if the peace process goes on. Bobby Sands is probably the most well-known name when it comes to the hunger strikers. Hunger strikers got a lot of coverage around the world and the United States for what they did and how they would starve themselves in the last 60 or 70 days and then die as martyrs. This is in the Belfast City Hall. These are some of my colleagues that were on this trip. I'm being the scoop in this picture, taking notes from the mayor who is next to me, Mayor Alvin Mcguinness. And Mcguinness was kind of a symbol of progress when it comes to the peace process in Northern Ireland, because he was the first Catholic mayor to be elected in Belfast. He made a great interview. This is one of the features that was picked up by a number of American newspapers while, from my trip. Is very articulate. He was also very interested in trying to make the two sides coexist. But he did say, he said that I will not swear loyalty to the Queen, which is what previous mayors did. I can't do that. But I do want to let the Unionists and Loyalists know that I'm not a threat to them. And he said it's also useful that for the first time, nationalist Catholics are not going by City Hall and cursing City Hall. They feel like they have some representation and ownership in Belfast, many of them for the first time. So he was kind of an indication of progress. This is our trip. It's sort of symbolic of our trip from Belfast to Derry. Of course, the Unionists call it Londonderry. The Nationalist Catholics call it Derry. So you have conflict right there. We toured both what the Protestants would call Londonderry and the Catholic Derry part of the city. And this is up on the high hill, the prosperous area, largely Protestant businesses at this time. Nice, prosperous, but one of the things that they wanted to point out to us is that they were constantly worried about bombing, and they would point out different cameras that were around the city to kind of monitor the possibility of suspicious characters who might be trying to cause a bombing. Of course, some of this is microwave towers and things, but I took this particular photo after they talked about surveillance, and of course, that's one of the sad things about the times we live in, is that we are increasingly in surveillance states all over the world. But is there any other option when you have this possibility of terrorism around the corner in so many parts of the world? This is kind of a bird's eye view of the Bogside, the area where Bernadette Devlin was involved in the 1968 protests, and of course later Bloody Sunday in 1972, which of course inspired the U2 song. And so the Bogside has its own sort of way of looking at things. It's interesting that the Catholics have their own schools. Of course, they have that here, but in the United States, what's interesting about their schools is they teach a different history. They teach culture differently. We went by some schools that had Palestinian flags flying along with the flag of the South. And I asked, well, why is that? And they said, because they identify with Palestinians. They feel like they're an occupied state. If you read Bernadette Devlin's book, you'll find that a lot of the nuns and teachers that she had were not shy about their militant republicanism. And that certainly influenced her, I think, in what she decided. Although she actually comes off as more moderate, she actually has to like tone down some of the nuns with some of the things that they're saying in her grade school and high school. So again, you have a lot of the murals and a lot of things that are indicators of the conflict that pervaded Derry or Londonderry, depending on your preference. So here, as you enter the Bogside, you see a sign that says you are now entering free Derry. That's the way they looked at it. They looked at it as, okay, we're isolated. We have this sort of ghetto that we're in, but we also are free because we can talk freely about how we feel about things, and we are more engaged in self-determination because we have this neighborhood that we live in. Some of us on the trip were troubled by the presence of all the murals and graffiti around the area. Of course, on the Bogside, some of the graffiti didn't pull any punches. They just said, "Unionists, Brits are leaving, start swimming." In other words, start swimming to the other side. Of course, this kind of inflaming comments certainly don't help the peace process, and certainly don't make the Unionists feel comfortable about what may come with a peace process. So this is the last slide and the last mural I show, but it's a slide again to Bernadette Devlin, who was involved in '68 and who witnessed the 72 killings, Bloody Sunday, which inspired U2 to do that Bloody Sunday song. I want to talk about Bernadette Devlin just briefly again, because I found her biography that she wrote, and again, it was published when she was 21. So I admired her just for that, to be able to. It's a very good book to read about the Troubles too. When she was in the United States, I think this is interesting. It shows some of her wit, but it also shows some of her defiance. Before she was to go on Johnny Carson, they said, "Why are you always wearing your jeans? Is that your uniform for the front for the revolution?" And she quipped back, "I would have worn something different, but the prods burnt my dry cleaners down." I don't think she was serious, but it shows a little bit of her take on things when she's confronted like that. She was there not just to plead the nationalist cause, but also to raise money for Catholic welfare. And in an interview, I have to give a couple quotes from her. In LA, there was a woman, a priest, and a man who was simultaneously head of 3 Catholic welfare groups in the United States, including the Knights of something or other. They told me they'd get a lot of money for the Catholic Relief Fund, $1 million minimum, if I would promise not to talk about Blacks, Protestants, or socialism. If I continued to talk about these unmentionables, they promised to take all their money back, which is just about what they did. A lot of people did. When everyone had taken their checks back at the end of my tour, we had a total of $45,000. But she said she had no regrets and she was not going to be silenced. So very defiant. Another thing from her US trip, which I thought was interesting, because it sort of shows her feminist side. She claimed that with her groups of Republicans, there was already equality between men and women, and she was confounded by some of the things she saw in the United States on her trip. She said, "I do find that people here, when they can't win an argument with me, when they run out of something better to complain about, they'll say something to me like this: 'You ought to be at home having children.' I tell them, I oughtn't be at home having children. I ought to be fighting the revolution. Why should I be having children just because I'm a woman?" she did have children. In fact, in the early 80s, there was an incident in which terrorists burst into her house and actually shot her several times in front of her children. So she was a mother and she did have children. I find her interesting, and I used her in a study that I did when I was at the University of Missouri. One of the things we had to, in Columbia, one of the things that the J School had us do, those of us who were majoring in the global emphasis of a master's in journalism, we had to take certain classes, and I took the politics of divided nations. That was a class we all had to take. Had a Korean professor who talked about North Korea and South Korea, a German professor who talked about East and West. We had several students from Vietnam. I'll never forget this class because emotions ran strong in this class. And I'll never forget the Vietnamese students were in tears in April, the night Saigon fell. And the Korean professor sort of took them to task and said, you didn't put up enough fight. The reason we were able to save South Korea is because we had a machine gunner trained on the front lines. And if they ever retreated, they were going to die anyway. So it was a pretty tough class. The professors liked me because I was the only student who did my paper on Ireland. And my paper really took a look at what is the struggle all about? And it was great background for me as a journalist to study this and prepare for the eventuality of perhaps going to Ireland and doing coverage of the Troubles. So my paper, and I think it's useful to refer to for this talk, took the view that there's really three ways of looking at the Troubles and what's caused them. One is it a neo-colonialist fight with Britain? Is it a sectarian fight between Protestants and Catholics? Or is it class warfare? Can you use a sort of Marxian analysis? It's interesting that I think Bernadette Devlin was kind of attracted to socialism and Marxism, and she even mentioned there that she was suspect when she came to the United States. In fact, they didn't let her back in the early 2000s when she wanted to come back in, because she did flirt with those ideas. And so let's take a look at the first one. I think it's impossible not to view the Troubles and what happened in Ireland as a colonialist conflict, because it goes back to what's called the plantation days, when the British came in about 1550 and confiscated Irish property, and particularly in the north, brought Scots and Protestants over from the northern UK to take over land. And obviously this did not sit well with the Catholic population. What followed was hundreds of years of bloody rebellions, and the British Army occasionally getting involved. I thought it was interesting that some of those military that were involved in suppressing things said, well, this is very much like what we're seeing in our colonies in the United States. And they even compared the Gaelic nationalists to the savages, the Indians that we are having to deal with in the United States. So you look at this, these decades and decades, centuries of bloody rebellions and put downs. Of course, we eventually get to around the World War I period, and right before that we had the Easter Uprising, which was unsuccessful. The martyrs who died in the Easter Uprising pretty much took the view that they were fighting British colonialism. And after World War I, when Republicans returned after serving the British, they then turned their guns on the British with sniper attacks. And I think if you look at some of the documents from that time, you realize that the Brits had had enough, at least in the South, and they negotiated the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. That established the 6 colonies. I mean, well, that's a slip of the tongue. The 6 counties in the north, which continued to stay with the United Kingdom, and then the 26 counties in the south, which became the Republic of Ireland. So the country was really officially divided at that point. Not everybody was happy on the Republican, the IRA side of this, because they wanted total unification. They wanted Brits out completely. The more moderate members of the IRA said, well, this is okay because we have a good number of Catholics in that area, and it'll be continuing turmoil in those 6 colonies, and eventually we will unify all of Ireland, despite this agreement that establishes these 6 counties. So that's the kind of like the colonial view of taking a look at the troubles and the conflict. The religious view says this is basically a battle between Protestants and Catholics. The Protestants, the Unionists, the Catholics, the Nationalists. The Protestants, kind of held back to the Church of England, Catholics to Roman Catholicism and the Vatican. So when you look at this as a religious conflict, you find that Protestants view Catholics or have viewed Catholics as conniving and hypocritical, amoral, if not immoral. Some of the things that they sort of pointed to is that they would say, well, Catholics say they're pro-life, but here they have all these terrorists in their ranks. They failed to condemn the hunger strikes, which we view as essentially suicides. They made heroes out of the hunger strikers. When they buried them, they showed up in the tens of thousands to celebrate their deaths. We don't trust the Catholic religion. It's authoritarian, it's theocratic. We think the South is a theocracy, which has its first allegiance to the Pope. So the Catholics took the view of the Protestants. They viewed the Protestants as extremists, as obsessed with Satan, hell, and damnation. If you see the movie Belfast, there's a minister in there who gives a fire and brimstone sermon, which kind of reminded me of this Catholic view of the Protestants. And of course, the Catholics were especially, I mean, they could focus their outrage on a man named Reverend Ian Paisley, who was a minister with extreme unionist views. He was involved in helping create paramilitaries. He opposed civil rights legislation in the UK Parliament, or any kind of housing assistance for the Catholics. He opposed the Catholic schools. He said that Catholic children were being miseducated, and it was a waste of time for them to study Gaelic and Gaelic culture. He opposed the Easter Agreement. So he became known as the Reverend No as a minister, the Reverend No, because he said no to so many things Catholic and to the peace process as well. So I think that you can make the case that there's definitely religious sectarian prejudice on both sides. Some of these viewpoints of both religions, I think, are generalizations and stereotypes, but they all have some truth. There's always maybe some truth in stereotypes that people adopt. If you read Devlin's book, she talks about the divide between the religions and how important that is in contributing to the conflict, but she took more of a socialist Marxian view. So when I did the study paper, that was the third leg of my paper. I talked about the colonialism aspect, talked about the religious division between the Protestants and the Catholics. But a number of Republicans, like Bernadette Devlin, were attracted to socialism and maybe to some of the Marxist beliefs. Their beliefs were that the troubles, as they're called, were not about religious warfare, they were about class warfare. And that if you really wanted to understand it, you had to go to Karl Marx and look at his dialectic when it comes to class warfare. And I think Devlin subscribed to this. She said capitalist elites need the division of having an oppressed minority. And she said, so the division of the working class helped keep them in power and also enabled them to control labor and pay lower wages because there were all these unemployed in the oppressed minority. Nobody wants to be part of the oppressed minority. Devlin also said this, which is consistent with that Marxist view. She said, nothing will change if Ireland is united as long as it's a capitalist Ireland, because the only thing that'll change is right now in Northern Ireland, 2/3 of the Protestants are the majority and they oppress the 1/3 that are Catholics. If the Brits were to leave and there were to be unification, then the Protestants suddenly become 1/5 of the population, and they become the minority, and then they become the ones who are oppressed and are taken advantage of and are used by the capitalists. So the Marxian view was to say that peace will only be possible with global trade unionism. I don't subscribe to the Marxist view, but I think it's important to bring it in to any study of the Irish Troubles because it was so important to a lot of the Republican views, particularly those of Devlin. In the Marxian analysis, they talked a lot about global trade unionism. I think it's interesting that after the Easter Agreement, both sides lost followers, and part of it was because you finally had stability. You finally had people and different countries interested in investing in Northern Ireland. So you saw a bit of prosperity that had never been seen before, and the so-called Celtic Tiger, which alludes to the economic success in Ireland, both in the south and the north. Prosperity lifts all boats. All sides benefit from this, and so that's a way to calm things down. Also, EU membership in the European Union, because you had both the South and the North as members of the European Union, there was more cooperation on trade, on business, and some of the animosities and secularism fell by the wayside in the way of progress and in the way of unification. So I'll end this presentation by just saying that the folks that I talk to over there now are very concerned about the Troubles returning. And the reason for that is because, of course, Britain is leaving Brexit they're leaving because of Brexit, because of the vote to split the United Kingdom from the European Union. So you go back to a sort of troubling situation where the South is still part of the European Union. The North has to have greater ties with the United Kingdom. And then you get into the whole thing about borders, trade, tariffs, a new situation. And we've already seen some violence already because of people upset about what's going to happen and how is Britain's leaving the European Union going to affect the whole island because of that situation. So something certainly for international students, international observers to keep their eye on when it comes to what will be the future of Ireland, and will we see some kind of a return to the Troubles. So I thank you for your patience, and I finally got a chance to use my 90-page paper from my class back in grad school. So I appreciate that opportunity. So I also want to thank UMSL and Professor Wall for inviting me to be a part of this. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Don, for a wonderful presentation. I see that there's one question in the Q&A, so I'm just going to talk for a minute or two, and so that other people can get their questions in there. So this is International Week at UMSL, so it's very, very appropriate that Don would speak to us on this, and I think that one thing that we've learned about Ireland and the Irish conflict is how relevant it is both to Ireland and to other places, as I think that you pointed out so well, Don. Also, I think since we had international studies, it was originally international studies and is now UMSL Global at UMSL. A focus, one of the primary focuses has been, and we thank our former director, Joel Glassman, for this, that one of the great innovations was the study of conflict resolution. And this is something that we've always been very, very interested in at UMSL Global, and engaged with through our connections with Ireland, but also through our connections with South Africa. You know, so in so many ways, this is it was a very, very timely presentation today. And of course, for me personally, it reminds me that we all need to travel to Ireland to see things for ourselves, right? And I think Don is a pioneer in this, you know, of going to Ireland. So I hope that if you haven't been to Ireland, you will take the opportunity, or you'll have the opportunity maybe sometime soon to go there. And it's also a reminder to me of Bernadette Devlin's book, Price of My Soul, which I read as a teenager, and just absolutely adored it. I thought it was a most wonderful book. A book that I believe is out of print now. It's very, very hard to get, you know. So thank you for that. So now I'm going to go into the Q&A, and we have a question here from Mark Sabelman. Don, do you see any lessons from the problems in Ireland that are applicable to the tribal split we seem to be developing in the United States today?
Well, I think that's a good question, because anybody who studies the Troubles, any American who studies the Troubles cannot help but be struck by the parallels, the polarization. And I think what is very troubling for us in the United States is that if we continue to polarize, if we continue to demonize, where does it lead to? It eventually leads to violence. And of course, one of the things that I find frightening is how heavily armed the citizenry is in the United States. And when we start talking about the survival of the Republic and who's the patriots, who's the bad guys, and then we get this mixed up with the number of weapons we have in the United States, it's very scary. I think it's worthwhile for Americans to think about that and to think about the Irish situation. I really recommend that people go take a look at the movie Belfast, which just came out, because it'll tear you up, and you'll come to realize how fragile democracies are and how we need to treat each other better, not just out of altruism or morality, but just out of survival. Because once you start down that slope of violence, it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
Very good. And Mark, thank you so much for the question. There is in the chat, there's a comment from Ellen Wentz. It's written as a comment, but I'm going to pose it as a question, right? So it goes, Don needs to write an article about Catholics supporting death, question mark. And, so.
Well, I'm not sure exactly where she's going with that. I do. Well, one of the interesting things that Devlin says, and I used it in my paper so many years ago, and it's very striking. She says, there are very few Christians in Northern Ireland. One American said that the most interesting thing about Holy Ireland was that its people hate each other in the name of Jesus Christ. And they do. In a country where national mentality arrests growth in every field of development and where the average man puts up with it, the big annual excitement is July 12th, the Kick the Papishes Day. You don't speak to your Catholic neighbors on the 12th of July, nor do they speak to you. And then she talks about, well, the Catholics have their day when they go after the Protestants. I think this is another troubling aspect of polarization in the United States. There has to be, people have their religious beliefs, but I think to make America work, there also has to be tolerance. There has to be an acceptance of pluralism. I'm struck by the end of Belfast, the movie. And I hate to be a spoiler about that movie, but the little boy in the movie he's Protestant and he has a Catholic girlfriend, and he says, Dad, is there any hope? He has a crush on this little girl, and he says, is there any hope for us? And his father, who is very moderate, believes in a pluralistic society, says, of course there'll be hope, and we will invite her to our house when she's older, whether she's a Protestant, a Hindu, a Buddhist, it doesn't matter if there's love. And very touching way to end that movie. And also very tragic when you see exploitation of religious differences in our own country, and when you see an increasing lack of tolerance, and when you actually, I think, see religious blocks are on one side or the other side of the polarization that's taken place in the United States in the last few decades.
Okay, thank you for that question. Here is a question from Amy Benoist, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I traveled to Belfast in 2019. I asked Sean, an Irish name, so I assume he was a nationalist, our mural guide, about Irish unification. He said most people do not want a united Ireland. He said 45% of the population is employed by the British government, that the Republic of Ireland could not afford to absorb the 6 counties. What sort of comments are Don and Professor Wall hearing? So I leave for today. I'll leave the comments to Don. Your thoughts on this, Don?
Well, I've heard that as well, and there is that concern. All the way back to Devlin and the Marxian view was that Britain has made Northern Ireland so dependent, and it's another argument for why Brexit should not have happened, because the real key to success for peace, in my view, was the European Union, was the integration of the European countries, and it did so much to sort of bring together the North and the South and a number of business enterprises. So, having said that, I think there is an element of in Northern Ireland of both nationalists and loyalists who are somewhat, are afraid of what will happen if Britain does leave. But I don't think it's just because of business. I think it's also just because will we return to sectarian violence?
Okay, thank you very much, Amy, for that question. The next question is from Patrick Dwyer. For Don, do you see a positive outcome with the Irish Catholic Joe Biden having on the Republic of Ireland?
It's funny you mentioned that. I was doing a little research this morning, and it turns out that fully half of American presidents had some Irish ancestry. And of course, Joe Biden kind of falls in the tradition of John Kennedy in being Catholic. I would suspect that because of that connection, Biden's probably going to be keeping an eye on Ireland just because it is close to his heart and close to his ancestry. So I don't know what that means, because he's certainly got a full plate here at home. But I think he has probably followed the Troubles, the Easter Agreement, the prospects for peace, the strain in seeing the European Union lost in Northern Ireland and some of the ramifications of that. So I think it's probably a positive at this time to have a president who's probably a little more sensitive about what's going on over there. But presidents have so much on their plate. I don't know, but I do think that's a positive for Ireland that Biden obviously is going to have a little more of an eye on what's going on over there than maybe some other presidents would.
Okay, thank you for the question, Patrick. We have two more questions. The next question is from John Wilson. For Don, have you seen the movie The Chuckle Brothers about Ian Paisley and Martin Mcguinness?
No, I haven't. I'll put that on my list. I did back in the 90s. I went to Trinity College and did a paper on what I considered the top 10 movies, and I'm going to the top 10 movies that have covered Ireland and the Troubles. And now I've had to add Belfast to my list and figure out what I'm going to take out. I'll probably take out The Devil's Own because I don't think that's as serious a movie as it should be about what's going on. But now it sounds like I might have to revise that list again. So I hope to be reminded of that movie again. That's another thing about Belfast, that movie. This poor kid is so tormented by his fears after hearing different sermons and different talk about the religions. And certainly I think Paisley would have been pretty scary for youngsters who were Catholic growing up during his time, because he did not mince words. He called the Pope the Antichrist. He even protested when he was a member of the European Union Parliament and heckled a papal appearance. So Paisley was, I don't think you can underestimate his contribution to the Troubles for some of the inflammatory things that he would say.
Okay, and thank you, John. I mean, one thing that we all always learn in these presentations, that there's another book to read, there's another movie to see. So thank you, thank you for that. And so maybe our final question then will be from Brian Macquarie. Aside from the hyper-partisan journalism in Northern Ireland, is the news coverage at all diverse?
Well, certainly much more diverse than it was at the time of Bernadette Devlin, and of course, at the time of that the Bogside riots took place and Bloody Sunday. Now, having said that, it's probably more diverse. That's an interesting word that he's using. Is it more truthful? Is it more clarifying does it help us get to the truth? And I would say probably not. I mean, because if you look at, I think the United States situation mirrors Ireland, and Ireland mirrors the United States. There's plenty of people who are getting their news from the internet, and from Facebook, and from sources that there are really no one. We talk about in journalism how there are gatekeepers who go through your copy, and they take out stuff that seems a little askance, that may be a little too extreme, that's just plain wrong. And the problem that we have as the world has become more dependent on internet sources for their news is that there is nobody there. I mean, the Facebook founders tried to say that they're keeping, that they have some control, and they do limit some things. But the truth is that it's such a huge faucet of information that's beyond their scope to really be able to control it. So yes, to answer Brian's question, the news is more diverse. Is it more helpful? Is it less partisan? I don't think so. I think people, both in the United States and in Ireland, sort of choose their poison when they want to find out. They can find plenty of sites that tailor the news to their opinions, and that's a problem for the whole world.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Brian, and thank you everybody for all of the great questions. The questions help us to engage with the speaker, and they're always really good. So thank you so much for those questions and for those comments. And but thank you also so much for joining us today for this presentation by Don Carrigan, and joining us at UMSL in the middle of International Week. If you want a reprise of it, it will be up on the UMSL Global YouTube page in a little bit. If you want to watch, revisit yourself, or tell your friends or colleagues about it. And so it's been a great pleasure to have Don Carrigan here today. Not only is he is an award-winning and masterful journalist, but he's also a wonderful storyteller. And I suppose perhaps storytelling is something that is an integral part of journalism and of all writing. And I think I'm part of the Irish as well. And I think that Don has had this has this down. So thank you so much, Don, for your presentation, and for joining us in International Week at UMSL, for joining us at Irish Studies, and a happy Christmas and Thanksgiving and happy holiday, or whatever holiday people celebrate or don't celebrate, to everybody. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Eamon. I think you covered it all there.
Okay, thank you. And thank you. Okay. So bye-bye, everybody.